In May of 2005, a very bored ex-Marine decided to take advantage of the internet's anonymity to do something very unsavory. 46-year-old Thomas Montgomery, a married father of two, logged on to an internet chat room for teenagers named Pogo and set up a profile depicting a kind of alternate version of himself. In his heyday, Thomas had spent a few years in the United States Marine Corps, but had been discharged in his mid-20s with medical issues. In light of that, he chose a username that somewhat exaggerated his role in the services, Marine Sniper. Using an old photograph of himself in Marine Corps fatigues, Thomas posed as an 18-year-old jarhead sniper bound for the battlefields of Iraq in the coming months. He soon received a message from a user named Tall Hot Blonde, an 18-year-old girl who wished him luck on his fictional tour of Iraq. "I kept thinking, well, we're never going to meet," Thomas later said. "I'll just play the game with her," he said. Before long, their careless flirtations blossomed into something increasingly deeply meaningful. Tall Hot Blonde soon revealed that her name was Jessie, a high school senior from West Virginia with a passion for horses and softball. Thomas, on the other hand, painted her a picture of covert operations and elite special force units. In reality, he never once saw a shot fired in anger. He described himself as a stronger, more virile version of the real-world Thomas, standing at a muscle-bound 6 feet tall with bright red hair and icy blue eyes. The description prompted Jessie to send what was described as some very provocative photos. His plan to win a little female company appeared to be working like a charm, but his dependence on the buzz it gave him soon became unhealthy. "It became more real to me than real life," Thomas later said, and he proved to be as generous as he was affectionate. He sent Jessie gifts of cash and jewelry, and the pair supplemented their online conversations with perfumed handwritten love letters. It wasn't long before Thomas was arranging his schedule around his talks with Jessie, to the point that it became a debilitating addiction. "If I was smart, I would have just ended it," he later said, "but it was like a drug that I needed every day." By this time, Thomas's online relationship wasn't just taking over his life, it was taking over his mind too. On January 2nd of 2006, he wrote a note in a digital journal that he appeared to have been keeping, and it read, "Today, Thomas Montgomery, 46, ceases to exist. He is replaced by an 18-year-old battle-scarred Marine and is moving to West Virginia to be with the love of his life." He was clearly on the verge of a psychotic break, and as a result, his attempts to hide the affair from his family became increasingly lackadaisical. Finally, in March of 2006, Thomas neglected to log out of his Pogo account, and his conversations with Jessie were discovered by one of his daughters. Confused as to who this younger woman was, Thomas's daughter showed her mother, and she was furious. Having made a note of Jessie's home address, Thomas's wife wrote her a handwritten letter exposing her husband for the manipulative fantasist that he was. She enclosed a photograph of their family, having written on the back, "Let me introduce you to these people. That's me, these are our daughters, but the man in the center is Tom, the one you've been talking to. He's not 18, he's 46, and he's been my husband since 1989. Jessie was horrified and broke off the relationship with Thomas immediately. "I hate you," she said in a hastily typed text. "You should be in jail for this." Thomas was left to deal with the fallout of his digital infidelities, believing his relationship with Jessie was over and done with. But meanwhile, unbeknownst to the Montgomery family, Jessie set about verifying the whole story by contacting one of Thomas's coworkers. 22-year-old part-time machinist Brian Barrett found himself the surprise recipient of an email from Jessie, and once again, an online romance rapidly blossomed. Given their similar ages and interests, Jessie and Brian were a much better fit for each other, with the latter becoming a shoulder to cry on after confirming the former's worst fears. They talked for a few months, becoming more and more flirtatious until Brian asked Jessie to be his girlfriend. After a series of long-distance telephone calls confirmed that Brian was indeed real, Jessie planned for the couple to meet that summer. The future looked bright, at least until a familiar username slid into the young woman's DMs. It was from Marine Sniper, and the message simply read, "I miss you." As much as Jessie had been disgusted at Thomas's deception, she couldn't deny that she'd missed him. Thomas was a liar, but he had a way with words, and Jessie was a sucker for silver tongue. She welcomed her former beau's return, but she was honest about her relationship with Thomas's coworker, Brian. As an older, married man, she expected Thomas to take the news in stride, but she was wrong. Thomas's messages became frighteningly violent as he claimed that Brian would pay in blood for, and I quote, "taking what belongs to me." When Jessie defended her new boyfriend, Thomas turned on her too, calling her names that she would later describe as shockingly abusive. For Jessie, having someone that she had a deep affection for turn so suddenly vile was beyond upsetting, and unsurprisingly, she sought comfort in Brian. In retribution, Thomas took to the chat rooms Thomas still frequented, outing him as a middle-aged freak, and in some cases, accusing him of being a predator to children. Ironically, such extreme measures actually pushed Jessie back into Thomas's digital arms, as just after instances of chat room slander, she sent him a short 6-word message, "I ache to be with Tommy." Documentary filmmaker Barbara Schroeder later described the ensuing conversation as Thomas's jackpot. He was being accepted for being 47, she later said, and he still had this attractive young girl wanting him now. The only trouble was, Thomas was trying to have his cake and eat it too. In the aftermath of his online affairs discovery, Thomas had begged his wife not to leave him. Somehow, perhaps due to the lack of physical infidelity, he managed to save his marriage and promised his wife he'd cease any lurid online activity. Yet it wasn't long before the same old cravings set in, and eventually, Thomas returned to his old patterns behavior. He had no intention of losing his wife and children, but he was also dangerously addicted to his conversations with Jessie. To hide his activities from his wife, Thomas began talking to Jessie until the small hours of the morning, sacrificing his sleep and, in turn, his mental health in exchange for time with his online paramour. Once again, the obsession began to take a toll on his mental health. The more they talked, the less he slept, and the less Thomas slept, his grip on reality began to weaken. Finally, after weeks of almost constant talking, Jessie realized that she and Thomas had no future together, and she bravely broke things off with him during a long and heartfelt chat exchange. Jessie clearly hadn't learned from her first attempt to romantically reject the middle-aged ex-Marine. Thomas had been unhinged before, but now, he was absolutely psychotic. Behavioral therapists who later dealt with Thomas described him as frightening, and that the final rejection had sent him into an abyss. For weeks, Thomas stewed in a mix of hatred and a raw desire for revenge. Some believed that he deserted the chat room altogether, having been outed and humiliated not once, but twice. But Thomas wasn't gone. He was simply lurking, watching, waiting. As time went by, Jessie once again proposed a meeting with 22-year-old Brian Barrett. The invitation delighted him. His serendipitous internet romance was finally about to blossom into something tangible, something real, and he couldn't have been more excited about it. Yet Brian went on to make a fatal error of judgment, one born out of innocent desire to share his good news with others. Brian was now very active in the Pogo chat rooms, having been introduced to them by Jessie. He'd made a bunch of new friends, all of which knew Jessie and who were over the moon when they heard the news that they were going on their official first date. The thing is, these messages were shared in what was called the main chat, as opposed to direct or private messages. This meant anyone in the chat room could read and react to Brian's good news, including people lurking under assumed or random number usernames. People like Thomas Montgomery. On the afternoon of September 15, 2006, Brian Barrett finished his workday, closed out his shift, and then walked out into the parking lot towards his car. Out of the corner of his eye, Brian noticed a man standing by a white truck, a man who seemed to be staring at him as he fished around for his car keys. Brian shot the man a look, but didn't recognize him. Yet moments later, the man called out for his attention. Brian looked around for a second time, but on this occasion, the man was holding a long-barreled, semi-automatic rifle. It was Thomas. According to witnesses, the armed man stated something to the effect of, "should have stayed away," before 3 shots rang out. Brian was dead before he hit the blacktop. Police learned of the bizarre love triangle from Brian's co-workers, who were very familiar with his rivalry with Thomas, but while he remained on the loose, Jesse wasn't safe. The police pored over Brian's Pogo message history to track down any trace of Jesse's address, and when they did, they raced over to her property to ensure that she was safe. This is where police were in for yet another surprise, because instead of Jesse or her parents answering the door, a woman named Mary Sheeler greeted them instead. The officers demanded to know where Jesse was, but a frightened Mary Sheeler claimed to have no idea what they were talking about. When the officers made it clear that a man was on his way to kill her, Sheeler broke down. There was no Jesse, or more accurately, she had been masquerading as the bubbly 18-year-old the entire time. Jesse's pictures were of those of Mary's teenage daughter, who had no idea her mother was using them to catfish men online. And after cooperating with the police, Mary helped law enforcement bring Thomas Montgomery to justice. He later pled guilty to the murder, but in exchange for his plea, he received a reduced 20-year sentence instead of the death penalty. Prosecutors later attempted to charge Mary Sheeler as some kind of accessory to the crime, but the incident exposed gaping holes in the fight against cybercrime and internet deception in general. Some assert that she deliberately provoked the violence and that she delighted over the idea of 2 men fighting for her. Yet, in an interview with the BBC, Mary argues the contrary. "It was stupid. It should have never happened. I just never thought that it would go anywhere," she said. "I honestly thought that it would end, fall off, and that would be the end of it. I didn't want anyone to get hurt." Despite dodging charges, Mary didn't come away unscathed. Her own husband later divorced her over the incident, and the use of her daughter's pictures caused a rift that has yet to properly heal. We can't blame Mary Sheeler for the actions of Thomas Montgomery. Both were fantasists, but only one chose to pick up a firearm as a way of hurting the other. It's just a shame that an innocent young man had to be a kind of sacrificial lamb, a blood tribute to conclude a relationship based on lust, lies, and loathing. If you enjoyed this scary story, listen to thousands more, either over on the Let's Read YouTube channel or podcast.